A few years ago, the other thing is I'm a word person, so I have no images, nothing but words, and I'm reading because I, sculpt sentences. So forgive me if it's a bit dull. But a few years ago, I wrote a book about a few canonical North American writers who came to Istanbul and either wrote about it or spent extended amounts of time in the city while writing about other things. The first group included Mark Twain, Herman Melville, and Ernest Hemingway. A lot of people don't know that Hemingway spent quite a bit of time right around the War of Independence. He was there as a reporter. And the latter group, people who didn't write about the city but spent a lot of time, would have been James Baldwin. So I've done a bit of work on James Baldwin in Istanbul. The book was inspired partially by academic multiculturalism that at the time was still encouraging the reassessment of the North American literary heritage. And I wrote in parentheses was still because I was so angry when I was writing this, putting together this talk because of all the onslaught, of the American Institute, of the, American universities. And so, but one thing that this conference is showing me that it's alive and well and strong. And Stalin can sort of, bark all he wants all winter, and the writers keep writing all spring. That's something that Wallace Stevens said. And so the same thing is going on still with us, in Turkey in many ways, but we have to stay under the radar, seriously under the radar. My book was less interested in hegemonic agendas at the controls of American culture, however, than in considering the presence of an other non-Occidental culture in the writing of some of our most canonical writers. I asked the question, what if the outside had been alive and for years well inside North American literature? And more specifically, and I'll quote myself because it's easier, this is all plagiarized from myself, for a couple of books and some articles, and I brought them together, and then I'm going a bit forward. So I said, what if, for example, Istanbul and everything the place name conjures up for an Occidental audience has since at least the 19th century been active, though perhaps ignored. Now I would write overlooked because not recognized. Not ignored, but actually not recognized. Not only in the intertextual adaptations we see in the poetry of Emerson and Whitman, but as a real place directly experienced in canonical American letters. Perhaps the overreaching goal of the book was really to encourage North American writers to keep up with the transnational interests of their historically favorite writers who were read most exclusively and therefore restrictively in local national and nationalist terms. So we don't go to Mark Twain or Hemingway or Melville to talk about maybe France, maybe Western Europe, but certainly not anything east of Athens. It's just not, we don't think of them as a source for this. But they all came, they were all here, and they were writing about it. In this talk, for the purposes of the symposium on the long 19th century, I would like to revisit the writing of Herman Melville. I also feel humbled because he's from here. I'm a West Coaster, I'm an Oregonian, and I've been blahing about Herman Melville for years and years, have never really been here enough, kind of New York and then hop to Europe. So in many ways, I don't know anything, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'll be back. Let's see. So I want to revisit Melville, and because we are focusing on American-Islamic exchanges, I will apply my research on Istanbul to a discussion of the place of Islam in some of his works. Now, I misunderstood the point of the conference. Initially, I realized, I thought we were going to be talking about Islam. So I started pulling out all the Islamic references in his book, which was actually all about the Levant. So this could have been a completely different paper if I hadn't made that mistake, but I kind of like this one, so I'm glad I misunderstood. So again, the books I'm drawing from are my American Writers in Istanbul, 2009. I mean, that was quite a while ago. And then my more recent obsession, animals and the environment in Turkish culture. And so I And that came out end of 2019 with IB Tauris, now Bloomsbury. And I visit Melville in both of those books in different ways and connect to Islam and some of the things I'll talk about today. So what I've said above about the presence of Islam in the literature I examine in the books can also be said of the position of Islam in the case of Melville. A recalibrated reading of some of his writing can show us that Islam is active there, though perhaps not fully recognized because, again, not acknowledged because not always recognized. It was in Istanbul that Melville experienced his first direct encounter with a majority Muslim cityscape. He was suffering from melancholia following the tepid, if not hostile, reception in 1851 of his epic novel, Moby Dick. And he was also afflicted with various writerly physical ailments like sciatica and rheumatism and bad eyesight. The dude was a wreck, right? Sort of psychologically, emotionally, physically. And so his family encouraged him to go on an 8-month excursion through Europe and the Levant. They said the seafare might do his soul some good, much in the hopeful spirit of Ishmael, the narrator of Moby Dick, when he engaged himself to serve on the Pequod. Though initially reluctant, Melville finally agreed and set out on October 11th, 1856. 8-month tour. Like most cultivated Americans in the 19th century, and this is where I'm preaching to the converted about, excuse me if this is boring, but like most cultivated Americans in the 19th century, and certainly American romantic writers, because he's of the American romantic tradition, Melville carried within him a fair amount of armchair travel study of the Islamic Orient. Dorothy Finkelstein's 1971 survey of Melville's reading in Orientalism lists the many Near Eastern titles that were available in the library of the Albany Young Men's Association, which Melville had joined at the age of 15. So the reading meant that he had already voyaged east of Athens many times in his imagination. There are some differences in the representations of Islam we see in Moby Dick, written before the Old World Tour, and then the journal notes he took while there. And the journals are what I've been focusing on more than anything. The journals published 100 years later by Princeton University Press in 1955 under the title Journal of a Visit to Europe and the Levant can be read as a supplement to the novel in some ways. Moby Dick engages more abstractly with certain Islamic tenets Melville was versed in, while the second, the eyewitness accounts recorded in his travel journals, are often more concrete, embodied reporting of the cultural Islam he directly experienced. Like the Grand Tour that functioned partially as a finishing school for the upper classes in England and Europe, the Old World Tour en vogue in North America in the late 18th and 19th centuries was also inspired by, as you know, archaeological discoveries in the Near and Middle East and the developing interest in comparative religions and philology. But in the American case, Islamic civilizations that shared geography with ancient Christian cultures were, and still are, of particular interest due to popular founding narratives that conceived of North America typologically as the chosen land and New Jerusalem. A surge in Protestant missionary activity in the Ottoman Empire, and that's what we've been talking about so far today. And as you've mentioned, my home institution, Boğaziçi University, formerly Robert College, is one example of this surge of evangelical Protestant. The word evangelical hasn't come up yet, I think, in this room, but that is important. And real quick, the thing I wanted to say is that I've done a lot of reading in the archives at Boğaziçi, and one thing they were established to evangelize the Armenian community in Istanbul. So, and as long as they promised to stay away from the Turkish population, Muslim population, they were given freedoms. So that I think is a fascinating story. But of course they cheated, because the guy that ran it was doing, somebody else mentioned, didn't stick to the rules and started, teaching all kinds of things. Voila, where am I? Okay, so this surge in Protestant missionary activity led to a rise in narratives by and about Americans in Ottoman lands. Knickerbocker Magazine, one of North America's most important literary journals of the time, carried articles on the Near East in nearly every issue starting in January of 1836 until its final issue in 1865. Every issue. In fact, a fascination, an obsession. I also want to talk about Lord Byron and some of his Orientalist adventure stuff, but maybe later. Because I think this inspired some of that obsession, really, that interest. Compared to the English and European engagement with the Ottoman Empire that dates to the 15th century at least, the young American Republic's experience of the former Eastern Roman Empire was, of course, limited, I think. Writers like Melville were participants in a relatively nascent market for letters, journal articles, and public lectures that provided the backstory for what Usama Makdisi has called the apotheosis of American exceptionalism, meaning, while the young republic located its typological source materials in the pre-Islamic, pre-Christian Near East, it also saw itself as an unproblematic land of liberty compared to the untidy, deep history of the Eastern Mediterranean. And in the book, I really expand on that idea, that exceptionalism. Paradoxically, however, Melville's engagement with Islamic culture in the Ottoman Empire in both the novel and the journals goes hand in hand with his lifelong conversation and struggle with Christianity. So he's like all these good writers, he's a troublemaker. And he's pushing back against not only popular culture, but also just reigning narratives about the Middle East. Basim Larad, in Hidden Stories, Palestine and the Eastern Mediterranean, notes that Melville, like Mark Twain, was a harsh critic of sacred geography. Even as both writers participated in old world tourism, they satirize, especially Twain, or poke fun at it, and tend to emphasize the geopolitical necessity of unlearning what New World Americans think they know about Palestine and the heavily inscribed geography known as the Holy Land. So they wanted to, blow a lot of received knowledge out of the water. They were provocateurs. Added to the skepticism of the Judeo-Christian tradition was Melville's distrust of American utilitarianism and its obsession with progress and the new technologies feeding it. The triumph of American modernity is not a foregone conclusion in his fiction. Part of the challenge of Moby Dick was that it complicated and contested not only America's formative religious and secular values, but it also destabilized other essentialisms, including but not limited to the idols of manifest destiny, the melting pot, and multicultural US democracy. All these things are targeted in his work, especially Moby Dick. So, unencumbered by the evangelical Christian dreams and objectives of many of his fellow American travelers, Melville approaches the Near East and its majority religion with a creative writer's eye for detail and an open mind. Islam, particularly in the form of mystical Islam, is treated as a resource for spiritual investigation rather than as a mere latecomer to the Abrahamic tradition. Interesting for historians, but unessential to a Christian-centered study of the Orient. Okay, he didn't come with that prejudice. A common Protestant Christian belief was that Islam, as active faith, was something people needed to be saved from, like Judaism, not studied or contemplated in its own right, unlike Judaism as a typological precursor of Christianity. Melville, however, like all his fellow romantics, and that could be the English tradition, the French tradition, or the American, those are the ones I'm most familiar with, he was open to the wisdom non-Western religions might offer a pilgrim. I will mention a few things about Moby Dick the novel, but my main discussion of actual textual examples will be mostly from the journals. How much time do I have? Because I might run 6 minutes. Oh, well. I think what I'll do is I'm going to leap over a page of text and just talk about Ishmael, the name of the narrator. I think that's interesting. Ishmael is both the first person and omniscient narrator of the novel, and he shares his assumed name, right? Call me Ishmael, that enigmatic opening of the epic novel, Call Me Ishmael, with a figure that appears in all three Abrahamic religions. Ishmael is believed in all three to be the firstborn of Abraham. If in Judaism he is a questionable character, sometimes inclined toward wicked, idolatrous behavior, he is still blessed by God with a great nation. In Christianity, he is a wanderer in the wilderness, but protected by God and associated with orphans, exiles, and social outcasts. However, in Islam, Ishmael is recognized as a central prophet and an ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad himself. These cursory comments concerning the Islamic source of the novel's protagonist, the narrator, is as central to the action, if not more so than its anti-hero Ahab, as important. Will not do the topic justice at all and is material for a longer discussion. But for now, I want to emphasize that the novel both begins and ends with allusions to Islam. And I'm not talking about all the stuff in between. This suggests, among many other things, that the sole survivor of the human catastrophe that concludes Ahab's monomaniac quest for the inscrutable associates himself, call me Ishmael, with an archetypal wanderer that in another context is a future prophet. Ishmael survives to tell the story literally and figuratively. Again, this opens more questions than it answers, I think, and people are still pondering this because what I've just noticed, and I have to say I haven't looked at the research, in the last maybe 4 years, but it's just kind of avoided the whole topic of Islam and the connection. There's so many references. If I would have understood the real focus of the fact that I could just talk about maybe Islamic country references, I would have, maybe I'll do this in another paper, all the references to Turks in Moby Dick. So many, and Turkish textiles especially comes up a lot. Okay, so these cursory examples suggest that Islam is more than a mere foil for Melville's various arguments and experiments with Christian ideology. Historically, critics have directed their studies of metaphysical speculation in the novel to 3rd century Neoplatonism or Calvinism. These same moments also benefit from a study of them as Islamic borrowings. Melville preferred the dark romanticism of his mentor, Nathaniel Hawthorne, to the brighter transcendentalism of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the other elder statesman, literary statesman. But the younger writer's reading was guided by both. And it's an interesting, I don't know how people may know this, but starting in about 1846 and until the end of his life, Emerson himself translated 700 lines of Sufi poetry into English in his journal, lines he integrated into his own poems, his bad poems. He was a better essayist. He also wrote the preface of the first American edition of Sa'di's Gulistan in 1865. That's also worth more investigation. I've got 3 minutes, so I'm going to run to the, let's see here. Melville's access to the same primary source material can help account for the mystical musings and that conclude chapter 85 in The Fountain. Now, I've already been kind of laying the groundwork for this, so it might not make too much sense, but closing a descriptive chapter of the biotics of the sperm whale with a contrastive allegorical and metaphysical flourish, as he often does at the end of his little short chapters, the narrator offers the following, quote, "Doubts of all things earthly and intuitions of some things heavenly, this combination makes neither believer nor infidel, but makes a man who regards them both with equal eye." Here he echoes the spiritual dialecticism of the Gnostics or Mevlana much more closely than Christian idealism. So his journal entries on Istanbul will often reflect this mystical dialectic. In Istanbul, Melville often focuses on linked analogies between the physical topography of the Bosphorus Straits and the city, and nature and mysticism. His mysticism tends towards Islamic mysticism in the form of Sufism, as is often the case with American romantics, such as Emerson and Thoreau. The proximity, and this is where my talk is going to answer something you opened with, and it's interesting, didn't plan that. The proximity of death to life in the city, what he calls their coexistence, is manifested in the interplay of architecture and nature, he often notes. Visiting the ancient walls of the city, Melville writes, quote, "These walls seem skirted by forest of symmetry, the cypress growing thick as firs in a Scotch plantation, very old, a primal look, weird. The walls seem the inexorable bar between the mansions of the living and the dungeons of the dead. The cypress of the cemetery, ubiquitous cypress in Ottoman cemeteries, and the city walls come together and form a point of existential contact. This intermingling of absence and presence is weird," he says, according to the journal entry, which would mean unearthly in an early 19th century etymology. This unearthly and unexpected proximity of life and I'm done. Okay, I'm just gonna read one last poem. So I didn't see the 5 minutes. Let me just read this quick poem that he is in his journals. From bright Stamboul, death crosses over beneath the cypress evermore. His camp he pitches by the shore of Asia old, requiting his unsocial mood, Stamboul's immortal multitude. Bless Allah and the sherbet good, and Europe hold, even so the cleaving Bosphorus parts, life and death, dissembling hearts, over the gulf of the yearning starts to meet in fold. Thank you.